Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to Total War Warhammer. So, I wanted to start getting into the nitty-gritty of the individual units in this game, talk about them a little bit more in detail, and it'll help me sort of also figure out a little bit more about myself and about the units myself, and maybe be able to use them a little bit more efficiently. So what we're going to actually look at right now is the Humble Goblin. Now, this guy doesn't actually have the worst statistics in the world. If you sort of look at the flat statistics here, this is very comparable to something like an Empire Spearman. They do have poor leadership, it says, but it's actually higher than the Bretonnian Spearmen, and it's only 10 points lower than the Empire Spearman, which has a very, very good morale statistic. 10 points lower as well than something like the Orc Boys, and higher, of course, than the Night Goblins. So if we were to compare it to, for example, say, a Dwarf unit, these guys are obviously going to have much, much higher sort of morale there. You got 68 on their minor, a very sort of comparable unit at that sort of cost. The Empire over here has 60 as well on their sort of spearman units. Vampire counts, their morale is relatively irrelevant, so the 30 on the skeleton doesn't actually matter for anything. And then Warriors of Chaos, if we take a look at the Marauder here, 56, so it's 6 points higher on a 100 point more unit. So the Goblin doesn't actually have that big of a reliability problem. It's higher than the Bretonnians, it's lower than most others, but at the cost point, it's not that bad. The armor as well at 25 is pretty comparable to what you typically see at this bracket. The 30 is what you sort of want to see up for most units. Bretonnia used to have 40, which made them excellent, but of course that's not the case anymore. Dwarves have 80 at their low tier unit, but they have worse statistics to make up for that. Speed is decent at 33. Their melee attack is quite low at 20. Melee defense is pretty okay at 26. There's nothing really wrong with that. If we were to look again at Marauders here, they've got 28 and 34, which is quite high, but they're a much more expensive unit. If we were to compare it to the Empire Spearmen at 300, we're seeing something with 24 and 34. And weapon strength of 25. If we compare it to the Bretonnians, of course, you are looking at 24 and 38. So, like, these are lower numbers, but they're not terrible. They're behind by a small enough amount that that's not really going to come in to bite them too badly. Their weapon strength is pretty much the same. The biggest problem is that as a spear unit, you would think they would have a bonus versus large, but they don't. Instead, what they do have is a larger unit size, 120 manpower instead of your typical 90. That means that each individual goblin, since the way that this engine works, is attacking more often, you're going to actually get more damage out of a small number, or out of a large number of goblins than you will out of the 90 spearmen. Now, this isn't perfectly translated into the game because the goblins don't actually all fight. You're going to see that you're ranked up about 4 deep, even stretched out it's about 3 or 4 deep, and so you're only going to have about 2 ranks worth of goblins actually committing to combat. And that does mean that there's a lot that are not, but since they're smaller unit models and since they can stretch further, you're actually still going to get more of the unit fighting than you would of a single unit of spearmen who similarly stack up about 4 deep or thereabouts. So this unit actually does have some niche uses there. One of the other big advantages is 25 armor combined with the shielded bonus there. They've got the shield that's silver there. That means they've got 50% missile block chances compared to, for example, these Bretonnian guys here. They've got the bronze shield. That means they've got a 30% missile block chance. So they're better at absorbing missiles for a multitude of reasons. Also, you'll notice that their hit point total is pretty decent, actually, 5,220 for the Bretonnians. These guys have about 500 more hit points for the total unit. Now, each individual goblin has less, but that doesn't necessarily matter too much. So what can we take from all of this? Well, because their melee defense is lower, their armor is a little bit lower, they actually do suffer more in melee combat. The fact that they outnumber their opponent doesn't actually help them in terms of defense. What it does mean, though, is that their weapon strength and melee attack being relatively comparable to other factions, and their larger unit size means that they'll typically get a little bit more damage than you would expect out of them. They do have a tendency to run away from combat very, very quickly, and their durability is offset by their lower-ish morale. So you're going to often see these guys causing a decent amount of damage and then retreating. Now, of course, they will get completely curb stomped by anything higher tier, but you can actually use them quite effectively in combat against other similar low tier units. So if we were to put them up against spearmen arms with polearms, they actually make a pretty comparable unit at 300 versus 300, and similarly, these guys make a better screen than something like the polearms at arms because they've got that additional armor or shield bonus versus those missiles. They've got smaller unit models, they've got the ability to withstand a lot more damage because of the extra 500 hit points. So if they're getting shot at, these guys are a better unit to use as screening than any other 300-point unit. The only exception, of course, is the Dwarf Miners if you're getting shot at by something that is not armor-piercing, in which case you could argue that the Humble Goblin there is a little bit worse. So it does depend a little bit on what you're getting shot at by. So I think that this is all around a very sort of a decent unit for its purpose. The one major disadvantage compared to other 300-pointers is that, again, it does not have its bonus versus cavalry. And that does mean that if your opponent does just charge straight in with Crypt Horrors or something like that, this line is going to buckle and collapse a lot faster and a lot harder than any other low-level infantry unit in the game. So let's go ahead and look at a battle where I did use these guys. It's an autosave here. I cleared out my autosaves because it was getting a little bit too ridiculous here. So in any event, we've got our opponent here. He's got 4 units of spearmen with shields. He's got 3 great swords. You can see that I've got some veterancy on these goblins because I just had a few spare points left over, and they're very cheap to upgrade. He's got 2 units of outriders and 2 units of outriders, grenade launchers, the steam tank, Karl Franz, and the light wizard, whereas I've got Azag the Slaughter and a spider. So I've got plenty of support for these little goblins, but they're going to be at the forefront of my army, and I'm going to definitely be paying attention to how they perform. Obviously, they cannot be the backbone of your army when you're playing as the Orcs and Goblins, the Greenskins, because they just aren't going to have the killing power or the necessary mass or anything like that to really push through the enemy. So what we got here is just them being a screen, and they're going to get right into the front of the enemy army here and tie them up and force him to sort of fight them while my other units can either get into position, or they can start attacking his units from the flanks, or he can, you know, if he reinforces with the great swords, I can simply just reinforce with the big guns from behind. The goblins will inevitably flee, and then it'll bring them back into the fight after that. So we're going to pay attention to sort of how they perform here. We're not going to pay too much attention to this other stuff, because what we want to focus on really is the goblins and what they can do and what they're sort of capable of performing. Now, I do think that goblins as a unit are one of those things that you just really cannot rely on as the bulk of your army. I would not take a full goblin army, but I think that like somewhere between 4 to 6 of them can make actually a fairly decent melee push as your first wave of infantry, or, you know, as something to screen you from behind, although they don't have the bonus versus large, which is really necessary. Here, they've got the charge, they're coming in against superior infantry. The spearmen with shields, remember, do have a little bit of bonus morale and a little bit of bonus armor, defense compared to regular spearmen. Or actually, maybe the morale's the same, but in any event, you can see these goblins getting torn up pretty badly, but they're causing a lot of damage to these spearmen with the shields here. In fact, this unit of goblins, will just slow this down a little bit. Like, this unit of goblins has fled because of the proximity to the steam tank, causing it terror here. This unit of spearmen has taken 4 losses, but has barely caused any more hit point damage to this unit of goblins over here. The goblins over here caused 5 kills, and they've lost 3 goblins. Over here, we've lost 9 goblins, and we've caused 8 kills to those spearmen. And all across this front line, even though these are theoretically superior spearmen, I have got a bit of an edge going on for me here. Got breaking from the spearmen with shields over here as well, because of probably partly because of the terror from the Arachnarok, so we are seeing some equality coming out there. Now, you can see that these spearmen at 400 points are not really doing their best value against these goblins. That's 300 point value goblins. Now, of course, now that I've rammed in with the Orc Biggins as well, then the goblins are going to be less relevant to the fight, but on that initial clash, that sort of tied up the enemy and forced him to maneuver around as you were, I am actually doing a significant amount of damage here. We've got this rallied unit of goblins pouring back in to jam up and stop these greatswords here. They're getting chopped down by the greatswords very, very fast, but you have to remember just how much better those greatswords are. We have got Wah down on these guys as well, so you'd think that that would help them a little bit, but not enough to let them kill greatswords. Over here, we're pressing through the lines of the spearmen, and it's a little bit muddled, but you can see this combat here. Let's slow this down here. We can see this combat here was mostly a clean fight between the goblins versus this unit of spearmen. And the spearmen are down to 44 men. We've got 86 left in the goblin unit, way more health left in the goblins, and the spearmen have broken. So we can see that the goblins actually did really well. This was a double veterancy unit of goblins, though, so we have to remember that this is about a 350-point unit of goblins as opposed to a normal 300-point, but they're still taking on 400 points of infantry, and are doing a fairly good job of it. So I think that goblins, as they are going to be something that I need to consider taking a little bit more often here. But they can force a front line to engage them. They can actually do a decent job. You can see over here that the big guns have actually folded against these greatswords faster than these goblins have. Although the goblins, of course, not being necessarily in the brunt of the fighting, haven't taken the majority of the casualties there. And now the concept gets really muddled because both my opponent quits and the Ragnarok Spider is now free to fight these greatswords with the enemy's general and steam tank dead. So let's check the total numbers, though, for the kills from those goblins. We've got 45 kills on one unit, 76 on another, 27 on another, and 11 on another. This one was the one that was fighting the greatswords, as well as fled early on because of the proximity to the steam tank. We can compare this sort of to the kills caused by the spearmen with shields here. We got 18 kills, 34 kills, 36 kills. So we can assume that the 45 and 27 are going to be a little bit more representative of what these guys can do. And they're pretty comparable in terms of numbers caused, in terms of casualties, to the spearmen here, that were not getting rolled over much, much faster, or were otherwise unengaged. So these guys are comparable to a 400-point melee unit in some contexts. Now, I did get a clean charge against my opponent, but their charge bonus is only 8. The other advantage of having gotten that charge is it negated my opponent's charge bonus, which might have been a significant factor. So you can't say that the goblins are better than a 400-point unit of spearmen. That's typically not what we see, but they definitely did their role, and they did it quite well. So I think that for their price, the 300-point price infantry line, they're less of a specialist when compared to the spearmen or anything like that. If we look at the others, they're paying a little bit of a premium for their ability to focus down large, or so on and so forth. The spearmen arms with shields for the Bretonians. Excellent statistics, better weapon strength, better melee attack, and much better melee defense. A little bit lower leadership as well, but they sort of make up for this by the fact that they've got a fairly large bonus versus large, plus 14. And this makes them an anti-cavalry unit. We can see that again for the dwarves here. Their 300-point unit, 350-point unit as it were. They've actually got armor piercing rather than additional anything else, but they've got lower melee attack, lower melee defense, a much smaller unit size, almost half. So these guys, again, much sort of a niche role there for being a cheap unit for cracking enemy armor on the cheap. I don't really think that it's a good thing because most armored units are very, very expensive, but that's sort of the case there. We can run down the comparison as well to the Empire. Their 300-point unit, again, has a bonus versus large, making it a dedicated anti-cavalry unit. The Vampire Counts, their tar pit is probably the most comparable. The 300-point skeleton warriors, I would say. They come in the unit of 120. They're more susceptible to all forms of damage. Their melee attack is worse, their melee defense is worse, their weapon strength is higher, their charge bonus is worse, their speed is lower, and their leadership is much worse, their hit point pool being much higher. These guys are extremely comparable to the goblins in many respects. For the purpose of actually causing damage, though, I actually like the goblins just a little bit more. I think that they work out a little bit better. Their smaller unit size means that more are typically attacking in any given moment. It feels like, I haven't tested that thoroughly enough to know for sure, but I do find that they work just a little bit better at actually causing damage than the Skeleton Warriors. Of course, if you're just looking to bog down elites, Skeleton Warriors are by far better, but they're definitely the most comparable. And Warriors of Chaos have nothing quite comparable, but the closest would be the Marauders. The Marauders actually do tear up something like a unit of Goblins, but they're not really capable of surviving as much as the Goblins either, having 15 armor, poorer shield bonus, and so on and so forth. They're actually a decent unit in many respects, but I still think that they're one of the worst because they're 400 points instead of 300. So, like most factions, their 300-point unit is a specialist. It's meant for dealing with certain things. For the Orcs, it's actually meant to be used, in my opinion, as a mainline infantry, fighting other mainline infantry, fighting against those other 300-point units, and doing a fairly economical job of it. Would they have beaten things like swordsmen if those were the front line? I don't actually think they would, but I think that they did an excellent job against the much more expensive units of shielded spearmen. So anyway, that's our video focusing on the humble goblin for today. We'll be looking at other units as we go through the series. I think that this game has way too many units, so we won't be necessarily looking over things that have variants. For example, we'll look at the Night Goblins and we'll look at the Night Goblins with Fanatics under the same lens at the same time rather than separating them. But anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.